Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Demai, Chapter 2, Halacha 1. This is Part 3 of the Shir. And today we're getting into some of the boundaries of Eretz Yisrael, particularly Caesarea. This is going to be the Caesarea along the sea, not the Caesarea Philippi in the Goan. And part of what's going to be coming up is going to be this contrast between Demai and Shvius. Actually, very interesting issues because you get a lot of overlap and there's a lot of similarities. One of the similarities will be that non-Shvius produce that's going to be outside of Eretz Yisrael is not going to be subject to Demai or Shvius. And you can have cases where you will have Shvius produce in this exported product, and then you have to wonder about separating out tithes. It actually gets into some interesting stuff. Now, we're going to continue a little bit about what we were saying yesterday about Caesarea, and the Gamliel Zuga says that anywhere you can see the sea and the water there, that's going to be where you can eat the produce without tithing, because it was not conquered by either the Ole Mitzrayim or by the Ole Bavel area. So the Gemara continues, says, some wish to say that the permit extends until the Tower of Malcha. Others wish to say it extends until the cave of Talaman. And there are some very nice maps in the art scroll in Demai that has some of these locations and where experts think these are located. So if you're following along in the art scroll, we're on 16A1, and that's Aaron Yuda Leib. He's helping us in the shir today. He's a little bit overtired. So the Gemara is going to continue and talk about Caesarea and the permit without tithing. And Rabbi Abba Bar Mari says that the words of the rabbis in the Brisa state by implication that the pressed figs in Caesarea are exempt from Demai. And because the following are all going to be species of produce that are listed in the Brisa as being prohibited in Caesarea until the Demai tithe is taken out from there. What are we talking about? We're talking about wheat, bread, wine, oil, dates, rice, and cumin. This, by the way, these are going to be the 7 species that are going to be subject to the Demai obligation because they were imported to Caesarea from the Ole Bavel area. So if you're in Caesarea by the sea and you're seeing bread, you're seeing rice, you're seeing cumin, and you're buying it from there, you can assume that this was grown in Eretz Yisrael proper and imported, and you have to separate out the tithes, even the Demai tithes. Now, bread is added in here. Why would bread be in here? Well, bread is in addition to wheat, right? And why? Because bread is going to be subject to the challah obligation. And this Bryce is trying to teach that in addition to tithing the wheat as Demai in Caesarea, you also have to take challah when you make this wheat into dough. So we know that challah doraita is going to be within the land itself, and they added as a leniency, if some people want to tithe it and make challah outside of Eretz Yisrael, fine, but it doesn't have the real halachic status of challah. It's always going to be treated as challah d'Rabbanan and lenient, and the rules are going to be lenient. But over here, you're getting a case where you have this wheat, you've turned it into flour, you've made bread out of it, you have to separate out challah because this really is coming from Eretz Yisrael. And so even that, in this case where it's going to be in a d'Rabbanan state because the majority of the Jews aren't there, they're still going to expect you to separate challah in Caesarea. So the Gemara is going to continue, and it's going to talk about the dried figs. And we see here that the dried figs are not mentioned in the list. And the Gemara says, and the rabbis did not mention figs in this list. Why would that be? And this might imply that they're not going to be subject to the Demai tithe in Caesarea. Or perhaps you would say that dried figs in Caesarea are going to be subject to the Demai obligation, and they're not mentioned in the list, because Gemara says that they're already taught in the Mishnah that pressed figs are subject to the obligation outside of the land of Eretz Yisrael, so it's unnecessary for the rabbis to repeat themselves. The argument, though, is not correct. And the Gemara says, we taught in the Mishnah that rice and cumin are subject to the Demai obligation even outside the land, yet the rabbis mention that in this list here. So this is mentioned, the rice and cumin, in the Mishnah and in this list of what is prohibited in Caesarea. So why? So really the question is, why is it that pressed figs are going to be listed as prohibited without tithing? And the Gemara is going to answer that the pressed figs in Caesarea are permitted without being tithed. And we have a question on why that would be. So why would it be that they just didn't put it in? And why would it be that pressed figs in Caesarea are permitted without being tithed? Well, perhaps in Caesarea Maritima that they are growing a lot of figs, they're pressing them, or perhaps this being a Roman area at the time, they were importing figs from elsewhere. But certainly it's implying that the figs are being produced there locally, and because they're being produced there locally, you have to assume that they're not being imported from Eretz Yisrael, whereas the other ones are being imported. So Rabbi Abba Bar Mari has a list that is going to be of what's going to be tithed in Caesarea. And now we're going to continue with the Baraisa in regards to Shvius. Now again, if something is going to be outside of the land and grown outside of the land, you don't need to worry about sanctity for Shvius or worrying about handling it or being a Shvius merchant, things like that. So the Gemara continues and says that these listed items, which would be wheat, bread, and the wine, oil, dates, rice, and cumin, certainly not the pressed figs. This is not in the list. And the Gemara says, in other years of the 7-year Shemitah cycle, they're going to be considered Demai. So why would that be? Well, again, these 7 species are subject to the Demai obligation because they're coming from the Ole Babel territory of Eretz Yisrael into Caesarea Maritima, which is not going to be considered Eretz Yisrael. So in the Shvius year, you don't need to worry about doing Shvius on this, because if they're growing it locally and they're not growing it in Eretz Yisrael, then it's not going to have the Shvius Kedusha. So the Gemara is going to continue and it's going to challenge this, is to say, are these items permitted in Shvius? And could this be true? In other words, what's going on here? They should be, if you know that they're coming from Eretz Yisrael, then definitely it should be permitted in non-Shvius years as Demai. And in Shvius, the Gemara says, let them be prohibited in Shvius because of the Shvius prohibition. And there's a big question going on here on, if you have a case where in non-Shvius years, you're going to assume that these items in Caesarea come from the Ole Bavel area, then it means that they have to have the Demai obligation. And if it's Shvius, you have to assume that if this produce is coming from Eretz Yisrael, then it's still going to be subject to the laws of Shvius. But if it's going to be coming locally and only locally, then it's not going to be. So what's going on over here? One of the issues is a law called Sfichin. Sfichin is going to be something called aftergrowth, which could have been planted either illegally during the 7th year or grew naturally. And the sages banned it because there were too many people cheating where they would plant this and they would plant the fields and then they would lie and they would sell the produce and say, oh, these are aftergrowths. They grew naturally. And they would secretly plant the seeds and then they would be able to harvest it and sell it. So normally in Shvius, grain and vegetables that grow during Shvius, this is going to be prohibited to be consumed rabbinically, okay? And under biblical law, if something just grows by itself, it's going to be permitted for consumption. However, with a species like grains and vegetables, which produce a yield in the same years when they're planted, then the rabbis are going to withdraw the right of consumption. And the rabbis are worried about people cheating and going and secretly planting the vegetables. So what's going on over here? Why is it that you could have a case where if this produce is imported in the Shvius year, then you're still going to be treating it like Demai? What would be the issue? And the Gemara is going to answer. It's going to say that the Jews observe the Shemitah laws, and the Gemara says that, implying generally they're not going to sell Shvius produce. So we're not supposed to suspect Jews, including the Amoratim, of violating Shvius laws. But you're not allowed to do business with Shvius produce. So this, by the way, comes up in Shvius chapter 7, Halacha 1, which we just finished. And the idea is that the Jewish farmers are allowed to sell the 6th year produce in Shvius, and they're not going to be talking about the Sfichin. So if you're buying this in Caesarea during the 7th year, what they're trying to say about this wheat or this particular cumin or this particular wine or oil is they're saying it's, please assume that this is not a Shvius merchant, that this is not somebody trying to work with Sfichin, that this is somebody who got the produce in the 6th year, and maybe they're a little slow to sell it. And so even though it's a Shvius year, it's going to be subject to the tithes and the Demai tithes because you're assuming it's going to be 6th year produce. And the idea the Gemara brings up is that produce by a non-Jew is exempt from the Shvius prohibition. So we know that Sfichin is only going to be produce in the land owned by a Jew. It's not going to apply to land owned by a non-Jew. And so the idea of Sfichin is to stop this cheating and illegal planting during Shvius, and there's no reason to prohibit a non-Jew from planting during Shvius. And so the idea that the Gemara is basically suggesting is that some of the produce imported to Caesarea from Eretz Yisrael could be grown by Kuthians. And again, Kuthians are going to be this suspect group of converts that at certain points were observing, and certain points they were lax on things, and at certain points they were considered to be actually just non-Jews at the end. But at a certain point they were, and they were not observing all of the mitzvot. For instance, they were suspected, says Rosh Cirilio, of violating Shvius laws and selling Shvius produce. They were not following certainly any of the D'Rabbanan rules like Sfichin. So if you're getting produce over here from a Kuthian that came from Eretz Yisrael during the Shvius year, it's likely that this would be Shvius produce and it would be subject to the Sfichin rules. So you have a lot going on here. So if you're having produce that was grown within Caesarea itself, this is not going to be subject to Shvius sanctity, and it's not going to be subject to tithes. That's probably why the pressed figs, are not in this list for Caesarea. Now, if you're getting these other things in the 7th year, and the supplier says, well, I got it from a Jew, and it's the 7th year, And you can assume that the Jewish supplier was not giving him produce that was going to be sfichin. And so you're going to treat it like sixth-year ties. But if you have a case where you're unsure about it, the Kuthians at the time were not observing shvius or sfichin laws at all. And so you, as a Jew buying it in Caesarea, would have to make it subject to sfichin rules. So the question is going to be about the majority again, the laws of the majority. And so the Gemara continues and says, but the Jews and non-Jews together outnumber the Kuthians. So that's going to be, an issue, because the rabbis are teaching that you go by the majority of who are the suppliers to determine what's going to be the status. In other words, if the majority of the suppliers, let's say of cumin in Caesarea Maritima, are going to be Jews, okay, then you're going to say, oh, it's the seventh year, and you're going to assume that this is going to be sixth-year produce. If you have a case where, let's say, rice, for example, or let's just say pomegranates. We know that pomegranates came from the Kuthian area. So let's say pomegranates that are the Baden pomegranates that are being exported to, let's say the Baden pomegranates are being exported to Caesarea Maritima. You'd say, oh, this is likely going to be Kuthian produce. And then what you're going to say, because these Baden pomegranates likely came from the Kuthian area, you're going to treat it where it's going to have to be subject to the laws of the Sfichin decree if you're a Jew buying it. And so you're not supposed to be buying this produce or eating the produce of Sfichin. So you have an issue over there. Now, if you have it where it's coming from a non-Jew, then non-Jews are not going to be producing something that's going to be subject. It is going to be subject to Tevel laws if it came from in the land. But let's just continue. So the Gemara says, in other years of the 7-year Shemitah cycle, the listed items of Demai are not treated as definite Tevel, and because of this logic. So the idea says the Chazan Ish is going to be that he's going to be saying that this is going to be posing a question, not an answer. So the Chazan Ish is noting in Shvius 27 that if the basis of the permit of the produce is that all the produce sold by Jews is going to be from the 6th year, not from Shvius produce, then it should not be, or that it should be subject to the Demai obligation. And the Chazan Ish is trying to explain this Gemara as involving a set of prohibitions. In Shvius, the Torah not only prohibits somebody from working the land, but also is going to be prohibit leaving the crop. That he has to. The Torah makes sure that you have to leave the crop accessible for everybody to pick. And by the way, you're not allowed to create a protected field, says the Chazan Ish, and unlawfully block the public access to the field to make it prohibited. So perhaps what's going on is going to be where, if the produce was unlawfully cultivated by where they turn it into a protected courtyard, that could also be an issue. And so the Chazan Ish explains the Gemara is discussing why the produce brought to market in Shvius is not going to be prohibited on the grounds that we should assume that it was illegally protected at all. So the Chazan Ish is answering that Jews are not ordinarily suspected of guarding and protecting the fields. So you don't have to assume that the Jews did this. But since non-Jews are not forbidden to cultivate or guard their land, then the idea is only produce obtained from Kuthians is going to be subject to these prohibitions because they're in this weird suffix category. So you're going to, the Chazan Ish is pointing out that since Jews and non-Jews together are going to outnumber Kuthians, produce of unknown origin is going to be allowed. That's what he's saying. So the Gemara is going to continue. It's going to say, in other years of the 7-year Shemitah cycle, the listed items are Demai and are not treated as definite tevel, and because religious Jews rectify the produce by tithing it before selling it. And the produce of non-Jews is exempt from tithing. And therefore, produce from either of these sources is not definite tevel. And it's going to be true that produce grown by Kuthians is definite tevel. This, by the way, came up yesterday in the Shir, that they were known for tithing their own produce, says the Rosh Cirilio, but they didn't tithe the produce that they were selling. So you have to assume that at this time the Kuthian produce is going to be tevel. And the Gemara is continuing saying Jews and non-Jews outnumber Kuthians, and we follow the laws of the majority, so we're going to deem the produce to be not definite tevel, and we're just going to deem it to be merely demai. Again, why? Because we're not sure where this really came from and the status of it. And that's why we're treating it as demai. Now, the Gemara is going to talk about the borders of Caesarea with regard to the items prohibited in Caesarea by the words of the rabbis. And the Gemara continues and says, until where is going to be considered Caesarea Maritima, and the Caesarea region includes the Inn of the Pillar, the Inn of the Gazelle, and extends until Kfar Saba. Kfar Saba is still there, by the way. And the city of Sor is definitely like Caesarea. This is wherever we are worried about regards to tithing. Now, some of these areas are going to exist in old maps, and you can find, where is the Inn of Gazelle. They're going to, this comes up in a couple of other places. Rabbi Kanievsky is saying about this, that this type of produce is known with certainty to have grown in Eretz Yisrael from among Jews, and therefore it has to be tithed as definite tevel. So you could have some of these issues like right at the border, like what about the Inn of the Gazelle, right? So Rabbi Kanievsky's point is going to be, well, the Inn of the Gazelle, on one side where you can see the sea, this is going to be definitely where it's out of the land. At the Inn of the Gazelle, you're going to treat it as being owned by non-Jews, but within the land. And so then you still have a tevel issue, you have to tithe it. And the Gemara is going to talk about a type of fig that was grown and sold or just sold in Caesarea. And the Gemara says that the kul chosin were sold in Caesarea, and they are forbidden to be eaten without being tithed first. And the Gemara says because the majority of them come from Har HaMelech, which is in Eretz Yisrael. This, by the way, is going to be this is going to be like early ripening figs, says in Maestros. And so these are going to be from an area that are going to be like early ripening figs, these kul chosin. And it's like a visible variety, and it's going to probably come at an earlier time. So Rabbi Chia Barva says the concern is with the white ones. These are going to be the white figs. They ripen over 3 years. We covered this in Masechet Shvias. And so you can have issues where if you have one white fig, it took 3 years on the tree to get to that point where you can buy it. The Gemara is going to continue, and it's going to say that, but The rabbis of Caesarea say that the concern is only with the red ones, these red figs, and the Gemara is mentioning the possibility of certain produce in Caesarea being subject to shvius. So the Gemara now is going to go to, what about shvius in Bet She'an? Now Bet She'an is going to be this weird area that might have been owned by a non-Jew at the time, and some say that it was conquered by, it was not conquered by Yeshua and the conquering army, that they merely just paid taxes. And then some people are saying that the Ole Bavel territory never extended to there, and they left it out on purpose to make sure that poor people would have access to easy food without tithes during Shvius. So we're going to get into Bet She'an tomorrow, and I'm going to put my son to sleep and try to give him a bottle. Have a great day.